The Reagan era began, unsurprisingly, with his election to the presidency in 1980. Now, anyone could have beaten Jimmy Carter, but Reagan succeeded largely by pulling together many strands of conservatism. Reagan emphasized his belief in states' rights, and he condemned welfare cheats. He also condemned busing and affirmative action, and he won the support of religious conservatives, including the newly formed Moral Majority, by standing for family values, even though, in fact, he was the first U.S. president to have been divorced. Now, Reagan also appealed to the so-called white backlash, working-class white people who resented the advances that African Americans had made during the 1960s and 1970s. And economic conservatives liked his anti-union, low taxes, free market positions, and anti-government crusaders and libertarians liked his assertion that government was not the solution to problems, but was itself the problem. Then there were the Cold War hawks, who liked his militant anti-Soviet rhetoric and his desire to spend more on the military. Ultimately, the question of how we should imagine freedom and how we should allow for it is at the center of American history. And a big part of Ronald Reagan's vision of freedom was economic freedom, which he laid out in his Economic Bill of Rights. It would curtail union power, reduce federal regulation of industry and the environment, and most of all, lower taxes. All these ideas were a big part of the Reagan Revolution, but as we know, much of what he proposed had been brewing for years during the rise of conservatism. So the idea that lower taxes is the best way to spur economic growth is called supply-side economics, or trickle-down economics. Now, one of the central ideas of supply-side economics is that you have lower tax rates and you also cut government spending because, you know, the government has less money. Which, yeah, did not happen. The government is always good at cutting taxes, but it is never good at cutting spending. The Reagan era did see cuts to some programs, but the really expensive items, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, they remained largely intact. And instead of cutting the overall amount of spending, it actually went up considerably because of a defense spending binge that saw the national debt balloon to $2.7 trillion. The 80s saw rising economic inequality, although not nearly as dramatic as we see today. By the mid-1990s, the richest 1% controlled 40% of the nation's wealth, double the share from 20 years before. Meanwhile, the income of middle-class families stagnated, and that of the poorest 20% began to decline. Now, of course, Reagan is considered the darling of conservatives today, but by current standards, he was something of a moderate. I mean, yes, he cut taxes and he cut funding for programs that help the poor, like food stamps and school lunches, but during his second term, he worked effectively with the Democratic Congress. There's no bipartisanship today. Also, he left the big New Deal and Great Society programs largely intact. I mean, he was too old to believe in cutting Medicare. He was like, all of my friends are on this. And the 80s also didn't see the fulfillment of the desires of the Christian right. I mean, divorce rates went up, abortion continued to be legal, women didn't leave the workforce. In fact, Reagan appointed the first woman to the Supreme Court. All right, let's go to the thought bubble. In his first term, Ronald Reagan took a really hard line against the Soviet Union. He called it an evil empire and even once joked that the U.S. would begin bombing in 5 minutes. That was ill-advised. Reagan also sponsored the largest military buildup in U.S. history, including the MX missile. The highlight was his proposed Strategic Defense Initiative, aka Star Wars, space-based missiles and lasers for shooting Soviet missiles out of the sky. This was a fantastic idea, although it would have violated the 1972 Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, but anyway, it was technologically impossible to build. It's nothing like a reasonably close brush with nuclear apocalypse to tone down your rhetoric a little, and in his second term, Reagan was much more conciliatory toward the Soviets and worked to reduce the number of warheads. So Reagan was able to negotiate the first reduction in nuclear weapons with the new Soviet premier Mikhail Gorbachev in 1986. In fact, the two leaders might have tried to get rid of nuclear weapons altogether, but Reagan's unwillingness to give up his Star Wars initiative made that impossible. That was a big deal, but the rest of Reagan's foreign policy was somewhat less triumphant. For instance, he sent Marines to Lebanon as part of a peacekeeping mission, but then withdrew forces after 241 of them were killed by a car bomb. And Middle Eastern policy played a key role in the biggest controversy of Reagan's presidency, the Iran-Contra scandal. This was truly one of the craziest schemes ever hatched up by an American presidential administration, which is really saying something. The Contras were rebels seeking to overthrow the socialist Sandinista government of Nicaragua. Because they were anti-communist and the Cold War was in full swing, the Reagan administration wanted to support them, but Congress passed a law saying that they couldn't. So two administration officials, John Poindexter and Oliver North, got creative. They hatched a plan to sell arms to the Iranian government, still technically our enemies, and then funnel some of the profits from those illegal arms sales to the Contras. And Congress would never have to know about it, except that they found out. Congressional hearings followed, and we learned a lot about Ronald Reagan's penchant for delegating the details of his policy to underlings.